It is blacksmithing and artisanship. So when I set out to do my senior project, I wanted to do something that I could really enjoy, but also do something that I could do with my hands, because I want to do, I want to work probably in education or something later in life, so I wanted to, get something that I could get my hands dirty before I go off and do that. So I settled on blacksmithing, which is, as I'm sure you know, the ancient process of heating metal and shaping it, making tools and such. I learned the basics with my mentor, Charles Gill. I created some very basic tools. I started off making coat hangers, which I lost subsequently and never used. So I don't have any of those, and then I moved on to some basic tools. I have some butter knives, and a nice little spoon. My final goal was to create something that I could use to carry me forward if I chose to continue blacksmithing, so I wanted to create a blacksmithing hammer. I got most of the way through it before it developed a crack, likely from cooling too fast, but I'm not completely sure what caused it. So I wasn't able to finish it, but I got this far. I just had basically cooling and final shaping to do, and then attaching it to a handle, but it wasn't meant to be, I guess. So in doing research for this project, I wanted to connect blacksmithing to some larger patterns of labor and the role of artisans in society. So since the dawn of civilization, people have needed tools that they can't necessarily make themselves, right? So this is how division of labor came to be, where some people become skilled in a specific craft, and they create that craft, and people exchange goods and obtain them, even though they don't make them. So blacksmiths and other artisans like them would make all the tools for a given village or neighborhood. A basket weaver, a blacksmith, a chair maker, etc., shoemakers, and many more. So eventually a class of skilled laborers came into existence, came to be known as artisans. They would create a product from start to finish. They'd use hand tools to do it. And this system was structured by guilds, which were organizations that were made up of master craftsmen, and they guided craftspeople. They controlled the trade of a particular craft. There would have been a blacksmithing guild, a chairmakers guild. Some places even had thieves guilds. And they would control who could work in the profession. They would set certain standards and regulations, and they would generally uphold the economic interests of the profession that they were in charge of. Under this system, the way that one advanced was they started as an apprentice, doing a role not dissimilar to what I did with my mentor, where they would help the journeyman and the master craftsman, and they would learn the craft along the way. They were unpaid. They would just board with the master craftsman until they were deemed sufficient at doing their craft, at which point they would become journeymen, who were paid workers. They would own their tools, and they would create products working for a master craftsman, which not every worker would achieve this status as the owners of the shops. And that was sort of, the goal. Both the regulations of the guild and the very personal nature of making an entire product from start to finish resulted in a certain standard of quality in tools as well, and all crafts in general. This system couldn't last forever, and it ended with the Industrial Revolutions in the 18th and 19th centuries, which was an all-encompassing change in the way that labor and society was organized, and technology, in which machines were made that could produce the products that used to be made by artisans much more efficiently, much more cost effectively, and much more quickly. So the artisan class was forced to adapt. They had to become unskilled wage laborers working in factories. And the steps of creating a tool were parceled down into much smaller, repetitive tasks. A laborer would only perform one small piece of the puzzle, basically, over and over again. Famously, Adam Smith, who was a philosopher and economist, described the pin factory, where one worker rolls out the wire, the next worker cuts it, the next worker flattens out the head, so on and so forth, in about 18 different steps in the case of a pin factory. In many factories, these were all done by different people. So this sort of depersonalized the process of creating products. And it was different to artisan labor in a number of ways. The factory lifestyle was also incredibly harsh. As the Industrial Revolution went on, hours got longer, the pace of work got faster, the conditions in factories were horrible, child labor was frequent, and the nature of the work stripped away at the worker's individuality. And it also meant that the tools and even the products themselves that were created by the workers were no longer owned by the workers, but by the owners of the factories, the controllers of capital. And as labor was increasingly exploited by the capitalist class, income inequality grew to massive proportions and is still increasing to this day, ever since the Industrial Revolution. In addition to the social, societal impacts, there were also a number of negative environmental impacts of industry. The climate crisis that is ongoing, that I think we're all familiar with a lot of these statistics at this point, is a direct consequence of industrialization. The increasing sea levels, CO2 in the atmosphere, rising temperatures, etc., all the consequence of industrialization. So, the initial push to take another look at artisanship was in the Victorian era, during the arts and crafts movement, when the exploitation side of things had sort of been laid bare. It was impossible to ignore, and a nostalgia for guild systems arose once again. But this movement sort of missed the mark by not really taking into account that the structures, guilds, that had allowed for artisan labor to exist weren't there anymore. And if someone wanted to learn a trade, they had to have the money and the time to buy their own tools and to teach themselves. They had to be self-taught because there was no system to go from apprentice to journeyman, etc. So artisanal crafts sort of were relegated to luxury products only produced by people who were high class enough to afford to be able to create them, and consumed by the upper class people who could afford them. This resulted in the push toward artisanship sort of being laying dormant for a while, until more recently, when the climate crisis came into the public eye a little bit more, which has prompted people to take a look at artisanal craft again and ask what the value of that can be in a world where industry is sort of destroying our environment. Craft businesses today are much more likely to be engaging in environmentally sustainable practices than large corporations, and I think this movement acknowledges that it's very important to not only support craft businesses but other small businesses where the Victorian movement sort of was almost in denial of the technological progress that society has made that makes most products much cheaper to produce industrially. Supporting other local businesses that aren't just artisans can help us account for that. Craft businesses are also a great way to build community. A sense of identity is built in a community that has a lot of small crafts, because when an artisan laborer produces something, it's a very personal product. So by buying small communities together, events like farmers market provide accessible goods. They bring producers and consumers into a direct relationship with one another. And artisan crafts can be seen as a way of sort of building identities, preserving heritage, tradition, culture, while supporting other small businesses. I think can be seen as the answer to reducing the reliance on global supply chains. So in conclusion, centuries of economic development have pushed us away from artisanal craft, but the climate crisis has shown us that it is time to take another look at that and at other small businesses, and see how this is a valuable way to keep traditions alive and to keep our planet alive. So I'd like to give a special thanks to Charles Gill for teaching me how to work metal, and thank everyone for coming out here. And yeah, that's that. Any questions?
Could you pass around your beautiful products?
Yes. Not this one though. This is the bad butter knife. So I'm
Okay,
not gonna,
yeah, just give us the best.
Sorry.
Only the
We'll
most
start doing a different.
highest quality artisanal products.
Thank you. They still need some finishing work, some final.
So what does finishing work look like in blacksmithing?
Well, I would go in with a finer sandpaper, make it the grain less rough, because you don't want to be able to see that, and then oil.
Oil it. Oh, so just like woodworking.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. Sorry.
Yeah, your dad has a question. Speak loud and clear.
Yes, Father.
Okay, go ahead.
Hello, Grace.
Hello.
Good to see you. Yeah, good to see you virtually. So you talked about master craftsmen and journey men. I was wondering if you looked at the gender dimensions at all of labor production.
Yeah, sure. So in traditional society, European society, where this system was in place, this was generally considered to be the work of men. I think that in the modern movement, there's much more of an inclusion of women, and we don't use this as the guild hierarchy anymore in craft, but yeah, those were the terms of the time. But I didn't super thoroughly research the gender dimension of it, but modern craft is a lot more inclusive. I do know that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else?
How much of the process is, it requires a lot of heat, obviously, for the first bit.
Right.
I saw you with the red hot metal. Is much of the process heat, no heat? You said maybe that crack came from the cooling down maybe
Sure.
too rapidly. How much of the lifespan of developing a product is spent in that interchange between
Well,
heat
it
and
depends
cold?
on the size of the piece of metal you're working with, right? So with the butter knives I was working with, a very small piece of metal, you only have to stick that in the forge for a minute or two, and then, but it also cools down very quickly. So you spend you spend very little time hammering and then very little time in the forge. With a larger piece like the hammer, it takes a lot longer to heat up, but then once it's heated up, you can hit it for a while, especially because the kinetic energy of swinging your hammer against the metal continually generates heat, keeps it, so the harder you're hitting the metal, the longer it stays hot for. And also, once it's heated up the first time, the second heat is a lot less. So the majority of the time is spent actually pounding metal, but there's a lot of downtime in between.
So, I really liked the connection you were making between the arts and crafts movement and today, and talking specifically about what failed in the arts and crafts movement and how we cannot fail today. So I'm wondering, as you're looking at the artisan movement booming, and I think it especially, it's pretty prominent in like Vermont, especially when you look at like craft foods. There's such a big industry. I don't know if it would necessarily count, but how do you imagine we could still have small scale local producers who can produce affordable goods? That's not just for,
Sure.
upper Victorian class.
Right. I think there's a lot more resources available now to aspiring craftspeople than there were in the Victorian era, especially in places like Vermont, where there's a lot of grants and resources, classes and stuff available to people. I think making those available is key, because if people have the resources to be able to turn that into, a viable living, then I think it can begin to catch on. But promoting it, basically.
Right. And through like having different ways to have like public funds and nonprofits
exactly.
and ways that we can distribute resources to help.
Yeah. I think also a big part of it is just awareness. People understanding that this is a much more sustainable way to shop for food or tool or whatever you need,
Right.
and that when possible, and also you're likely to find higher quality goods through purchasing artisanally made goods. So whenever able to, it's the like, you can make a moral argument, you can make a quality argument. I think just spreading awareness of that is key.
Yeah. Do you think guilds could come back?
I don't know if in industrialized world that system is viable. Maybe.
It reminded
I'm
me
not
of like
sure.
becoming an electrician or becoming a
Yeah.
plumber. Like
Yeah.
it sounded like echoed that type of
Yeah, so
process.
something I didn't really touch on is that trades do still exist in those fields. And they operate in a somewhat similar way to how trades did then. But for producing goods, we turn to industry.